Welcome back. This is our second lecture of our tour of global history over 700 years. The theme of today's lecture is warfare in motion. To build on what we learned from last lecture about the ways in which the Silk Roads, the increasing connectedness of the Afro-Eurasian theaters gave rise to new social, religious, economic, and political structures. So let's just go back and review some of the main themes that we explored in the last lecture. As you'll recall, we talked about this process of increasing interconnectedness, that it was commercial, that it was religious, social, military, and political. And we might have asked ourselves, is this kind of map, in a way, a representation of the beginning of our globalization, that we could say that the processes that would lead up to the interdependencies of our current day began way back in the 14th century. Certainly we see the ways in which trade, conversion, and conquest created conveyors, and in a sense I could have said that the beginnings of globalization began with the sound of millions of hooves of Mongol cavalries bringing the parts of Afro-Eurasia together. But it was these very conveyors that also served for the movement, the motion of some invisible forces in world history. And so in a sense, our story for this lecture begins not with the thunder of the hooves, but with whimpers. Whimpers. Whimpers of millions and millions of people dying from invisible enemies that they did not understand. For this was the era known as the Black Death. In fact, the Black Death was a portmanteau term, just as the Silk Road was a portmanteau term to cover a lot of commercial arrangements. There were many diseases flowing through the very same arterial structures that connected Afro-Eurasia together. If you map on the previous representation of the commercial networks and look at the ways in which the corridors of trade also served as the corridors for the dissemination of disease, you can see what happened. That it was the very interconnectedness that created this great cataclysm that we call the Black Death. And it was devastating in particular in those most highly densely populated areas, especially along that southern beltway of Afro-Eurasia. The germs essentially, and the viruses, the multiple plagues followed the trade routes. The pathogens were carried on ships and on the caravans and infected all of the hubs and those global ports along the way that we talked about in the last lecture. Here was a scene of death and carnage that was typical of the age. The disease was borne by rats. Fleas on the rats carried the bacilli from rat to rat and then to humans, and was then the maker of gruesome spectacles of horrific proportions. The death rates were truly awful. China saw its population from a height of about 120 million people plunge to 80 million. Europe lost approximately 60% of its population. Most affected were the nerve centers, those nodes of that interconnected Afro-Eurasian system that we've been talking about, the trading posts, the caravan cities, and those global ports. Now, the Black Death was a sign that while societies were not yet interdependent in the way our globalization era is, it was increasingly interconnected. These parts of the world were in contact with each other, when it was that very contact that spread the diseases. The viruses and the plagues could spread thanks to the migration, the movement of the microfauna. And of course, it would create metaphors that we would use customarily to describe and use in later globalizations viruses, right? especially to describe financial crises. I'll get to that later in the course. Now, the Black Death was a blow then to this increasingly interconnected emerging system, this archaic globalization. It wiped out entire markets. It coincided with the fragmentation of the Mongol Empire, which had given a certain institutional ballast to the Afro-Eurasian system, and eventually spawned the rivalries between the descendants of the Mongol empires. So what ensued in the wake of all of this death was a round of chaos and conflict. Now, as often happens in ages of great destruction like this one, very often this is also an occasion for renewal. In a sense, it cleaned the slate and prepared the way for the emergence of new political systems across Afro-Eurasia. In a sense, it was the Mongols and then the invisible killers that ushered in a new phase in world history. Now, not all regions were affected by these processes. This is why it's important to note that we're talking about connectedness. Well, not all parts of the world were connected up in the same way. Not all regions were being affected by the visible and invisible forces of this archaic form of globalization. There are worlds apart. One place that was unaffected by the spread of disease was, of course, the Americas, which was cut off after the land bridge called Beringia that connected Siberia to North America was plunged underwater with rising seas. There in the Americas was the setting for major civilizations, high populations, but no contact, and therefore no borrowing, including borrowing from the pathogens of Afro-Eurasia, because there was no contact. And I'm going to go into that isolation and its effects in a subsequent lecture. But what's important to note is that the Americas were not part of the broader global pool of technologies, cultures, and pathogens, goods, technologies, and diseases, and so, in a sense, was a world apart. There were other regions that were less affected by these Afro-Eurasian dynamics. In fact, large parts of Africa itself were relatively immune because they were only partly connected up with those systems, especially in West and Southern Africa. There we see the rise of wealthy kingdoms that were relatively untouched by Afro-Eurasian dynamics until Europeans devised a way in which they could navigate down that western coast of Africa. Again, something I'm going to come back to in later lectures. But in North Africa and in East Africa, the dynamic was quite different. They were connected up, though not very intensively. They were nonetheless connected up with the Silk Road and the sea lanes. Mogadishu, for instance, was an important part of that sea lane trading system that we described in the last lecture. Indeed, that whole East African coastal region was known as the Swahili coast. This was from the Arabic word, the Sahel, which refers to the southern coast of the Sahara. And it would be all along that Swahili coast that we see Persians, Arabs, Jews, South Asians, Buddhists, and eventually Chinese migrants would set up and populate towns and eventually cities up and down the coast to trade for ivory and foodstuffs, but most of all for gold. And we're going to come back to this over and over again, the ways in which Africa was the source of an important commodity, which was gold, which injected liquidity into the Afro-Eurasian trading system. It was very important to keep that Arab mercantile trading networks that we talked about in the last lecture, keep them going. Of course, a centerpiece of a lot of these coastal towns and cities was in fact the mosque, as the Arab mercantile culture often dominated these settlements. For instance, in Kilwa, a good example of this, an island off the east coast of Africa, founded by Muslims who had moved from Persia. They weren't Arabs, they were Persians, built the largest mosque in sub-Saharan Africa. The result was the creation of a lot of mixed communities up and down this Swahili coast. Africans and migrants from the Shiraz region of Persia created these multicultural communities, and often produced religious hybrids between Islam and local religious systems. And so we could begin to see what we call syncretic cultures emerging along these global systems. So Islam would get amalgamated with local understandings of witchcraft and rainmaking practices. One Chinese chronicler who visited the site would report back to Beijing, and I'm reading here, this is a man called Joao Rugua. He would note that many people practice magical arts here, and he's referring to East Africa, and can change themselves into birds and beasts or sea creatures to frighten and delude the foolish commoners. If their business dealings with a foreign ship arises, they cast a spell to bring the ship to a standstill, so it cannot move forwards or backwards, and only when the crew have consented to make peace will they let them go. It was testimonials like this that evoke a world of mixture, migration, motion, a very dynamic region along this east coast of Africa. So one salient aspect of these ports on East Africa was the ways in which Arab and Persian merchants adapted to the African practices of slavery, which included enslavement of Africans for employment inside households. And there, Arabs and Persians saw the ways in which African households would adopt slaves into families. And they soon began the practice of shipping slaves that were used as household bonded labor in Africa, shipping them outside Africa. By 1150, we have evidence that the connectedness of East Africa with the Afro-Eurasian trading system yielded to African slaves being sold as far away as the port of Canton, working in firms of Arab merchants and Arab settlers as far away as China. And this would foreshadow a great transformation centuries later. And we see on the fringes then of Africa the beginnings of African contact with the rest of the world, creating, therefore, new belief systems, new cultures, which will become an important theme of this course, mixing of populations. So it was not just commodities that were on the move, but also people. So I'm going to pause here at the end of this first segment, give you an opportunity to collect your thoughts and consider how evenly then the spread of the process of global connection was before the 15th century.